You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Brobears Talk. Today we're going to be talking about Bitcoin. It's the second half of Bitcoin. We already had a decent podcast. I recommend you go and check it out. Brother Bear, so there was a huge historic event that took place on the 9th of June on Wednesday, 2021. And in my mind, that's going to be a date that's going to be remembered forevermore. Can you guess what happened on this amazing day?
On this beautiful dawn of reckoning. So the good thing about having Google open in front of me is I just typed in June 9th Bitcoin and have glanced over the
No, you've ruined it.
I know, I'm sorry. I had to because I didn't want to appear too stupid.
You're the acting Jamie.
I am, yeah. I'm Jamie. I'm the interim Jamie right here. I'll tell you what, though. I've been observing some of the trends before, Brother Bear, and I've seen it's been taking a dip, and Mr. Musk has had his contributions towards that. But I see here up 12.7%. Is this the crazy historic event on the 9th, or is there something deeper you're going to tell me?
Much bigger and greater.
Good, because that would have been a disappointment.
El Salvador Congress has approved. El Presidente Nayib Bukele, his proposal to embrace the cryptocurrency and officially bring it in as a legal tender in the country of El Salvador passed with a supermajority. So 62 out of the 84 possible votes were cast in favour. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We have Bitcoin as legal tender. Brother Bear, this is huge. I think the implications of this will take a while to sink in and fully appreciate. I think this is just the first domino. I think a state adopting Bitcoin as legal tender, the gravity of this cannot be understated.
It's huge. It's absolutely huge, because what it shows is that an entire nation state and all of its politicians, all of its political class, basically have the humility to acknowledge that central banking is inadequate. Central banking is no longer serving the needs of the people, which is what it was developed to do. So I think congratulations to El Salvador for doing this. I think it's going to be a huge development for them as a nation, but also globally. Globally, this digital currency couldn't have had better news.
This is huge, and I think it's weird that a few days beforehand I'd sent you some audio messages around which country will be the first to put some Bitcoin on its reserve balance sheet, its state balance sheet. And I think that's almost the next step for El Salvador. So I think El Salvador's top of that list in terms of candidates, but I hadn't even entertained that actually, as opposed to, it's almost the wrong way around for me. I would have thought the less risky step would have been to put some Bitcoin, whatever allocation, onto the state balance sheet and then introduce something like Bitcoin as legal tender. That would be the way I'd see it. But they've done it backwards, and this is almost bigger than putting some Bitcoin on the balance sheet. But it was very interesting how it came about, because I heard the news, then I jumped onto Twitter, our Brobears Talk account, and I recommend you guys check us out there. Follow us. It's all very crypto related. Brother Bear, sorry, I've somewhat hijacked the account.
It's been hijacked by just crypto messaging, hasn't it? I know it has. I know it. I don't even need to look at it, and I know it's gonna. I know it. Every single tweet will be about the value, like up, sell, don't sell. It's digital banking has replaced the banking system.
It's a bit deeper than that.
Cash is trash.
Cash is trash. Cash is trash. Yeah, well, it's a lot of that, but also there is some. I'd like to think some more sophisticated material out there. But yes, I haven't antagonized Elon and tried to reach out to him personally because he upset the Bitcoin community. We can go into that in a bit.
Yes, yeah, because I've wanted to pick your brains on that for a couple of weeks now.
Yes.
But to your point about the movement in El Salvador, the kind of government endorsed Bitcoin revolution, I think it's absolutely brilliant. I know we had our money on countries like Switzerland or perhaps island nations and tax havens in the Caribbean. So I think it's really interesting that a Latin American state adopted it. Any reason? I mean, maybe we're about to go into this, Brother Bear, but any reason why you think El Salvador, out of all nations took it upon themselves to do this?
Yeah, good question. I think it's South America is the broader geography, and I wouldn't have been able to tell. Sort of retrospectively, it makes a lot of sense now. The reason being is that a lot of South American currencies are broken, hyperinflated to the point of no longer actually being useful. Venezuela springs to mind, but El Salvador's not that far behind and heading in the same direction. So it's almost to save the country, and I mean, it really is hope for El Salvador and probably the world at large ultimately, because the president, would you believe it? This guy, by the way, sorry, I'm just jumping all over the place. It's just very overwhelming.
Meander.
Like this guy, Nick Carter, who I follow on Twitter, he's like a big influencer and a big sort of spokesperson for the Bitcoin community. Created just some spaces. A spaces is a new Twitter feature function on Twitter where you can just it's essentially like what's the name of that? Oh, Clubhouse, that app. So basically you just create a room and people create a chat spontaneously, and you can join the chat and you can put your hand up and raise questions, but it's basically a live chat, and there's a select number of individuals who can speak and the rest are there as an audience, so they're muted. But it's just a spontaneous chat. So I don't know how this is like almost a new form of media that's developed out of podcasts. It's just a live chat, and anyone can create a room, and people join that room, and they join in the capacity of an audience in most cases, and you can be made a speaker if you want. And it's a really fascinating form of media that's sort of developing, and I'm not sure whether it's here to stay or not. But it's very engaging and very spontaneous, and sort of can just arise almost out of nothing. So he created a room. A number of sort of bigwigs from the sort of the Twitter crypto space joined, and then some congressman who had literally just left. They just won the vote, and he just he could literally hear you could hear the clapping in the background. And I joined it live.
Wow.
It's sort of like 7 a.m. in the morning in the UK, and I was very aware that I was experiencing a historic moment. And then, of all people, the president of El Salvador joined the room. And he started telling everyone, and he's like, "This is amazing, guys. Listen to the clapping. They're clapping. They're still clapping 10 minutes later." And he's like, "This is for the first time our youth, our young people have hope, and they're excited about the future for the first time in a very long time."
That's so interesting in the context of Latin America, because so many of those nations have been wrought with inflation, hyperinflation since the Reagan era. We think we have it bad in the West. But it doesn't even come close to the kind of lack of, I suppose, financial buoyancy on an individual level for young people in these countries. So I think it's awesome that the government has endorsed this, because the thing that's so incredible about this is it's probably not completely in their interest to do so. I mean, and that to my mind is perhaps I'm being a bit naive there, but from my perspective, the job of the politician is to stand by and defend central banking, whatever the cost to their own career, and that's an incredibly interesting movement. But now it looks like the political class in El Salvador, at least the president, is got this attitude of, you know what, let's run these bums out, let's have a financial revolution, let's give young people some hope for their futures.
Yes, exactly. And funnily enough, they're opening themselves up to more economic terrorism through the dollar, right? Which the US is well known for. Well, sort of economic terrorism, I use that as sort of as a maybe a more dramatic term than it needs to be, but just how the US leverages its power by having the world's reserve currency within its grasp to wage almost economic sanctions, whether that's on South America or Russia or China or wherever. So
absolutely. In the same way, I mean, I suppose our parallel in Europe would be the way that the euro's use as a kind of debt weapon against countries like Greece and Portugal.
Yes, exactly. So they sort of had them by the neck, I think, and now that they're moving to this Bitcoin standard, and it really is an experiment, because let's be honest, as amazing as this all sounds, we don't quite know how it's going to land. Ultimately, and it really is an experiment in real time. We're experiencing this experiment on 6.5 million people that live in El Salvador, and basically it's a new law that means every business must accept Bitcoin by law as legal tender for goods and services, and the only exception to that is if it's unable to provide the technology needed to actually execute the transaction.
That's incredible. Like when you break it down to kind of the enforcement and the legal level, say that you're just a greengrocer on the corner. And now you are legally required to accept Bitcoin. It's just so interesting. It shows such a lack of faith in the current financial fiat, in the current financial spectrum, but also fiat currency, but also a very kind of daring attitude. As you just said, it's a bit of a crapshoot, right? I mean, you and I are very philosophically aligned to Bitcoin. But if I look deep into my heart, it is an experiment. We are kind of rolling the dice. We don't know what the effects will be on, fiat currency and world economics. So, more power to countries that take those risks, with the hope of bettering themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think it would necessarily constitute a failure in the slightest if it were to actually not become the money itself, but actually the standard against which you benchmark your money, and you almost go back to a gold standard of sorts, but this time a Bitcoin standard. So where you peg your dollar, your peso, whatever, to a standard, and this being the mathematically validated, the strongest, the hardest money there is, the realest, soundest money ever created.
Yes.
Pegging your dollar, whatever your currency, fill in the blank, to the Bitcoin standard and the finite supply, wouldn't be a bad move at all.
I think that you're onto something quite interesting there, Brother Bear, and that is having a bi-monetary system. And in the UK, actually, back in the day, kind of in the Edwardian era, they had a bi-metal system. And there was kind of a rivalry between silver and gold. Those were the two metals, and they were in constant rivalry. What this movement may do in El Salvador is it may not eradicate the dollar, it may not eradicate the fiat currency in El Salvador, but what it will do is keep it in check. It will keep a strong leash on it. So for example, if the fiat currency, and forgive me for not actually knowing what the fiat currency is in El Salvador, but if that currency starts to inflate disproportionately, and suddenly you see a bunch of bananas or a coffee going up substantially, well, then the public are going to take a democratic decision to say, well, you know what, screw that, we're going to move to Bitcoin and pay for our coffees in bits, because that's going to be more favorable. And what's that going to do? That's going to keep a strong chokehold on the central banking powers that be from just running amok with their printing press.
Yes, exactly. Very well said. And I've just looked it up, actually. It is the United States dollar itself that's the legal tender in El Salvador, apart from that. So it really was kind of, the US had its leverage there. So it almost makes that much more sense now, thinking about it.
That's the thing, isn't it? I think, and this is a wider conversation philosophically about Bitcoin, is that it's not about financial gain necessarily. I mean, it is.
No.
But it's I'd say it's so much deeper than that, because it's about democracy.
Yes.
People's economic individual rights have been eroded since Bretton Woods, and even more eroded since Nixon relinquished the gold standard in 1978, to the point at which there really aren't any financial rights anymore. It's pretty much non-existent. So this is really interesting, because what it provides is essentially a new democratic apparatus for people's day-to-day trade, commerce, financial decisions.
Yes. It's a beautiful technology, and I think it's the first example, probably since the hippie movement, of a truly bottom-up revolution.
Absolutely. I think we actually concluded that a few podcasts back. That the beauty of this is that it's not, you've not got these kind of grand poobahs leading the revolution and imposing a top-down state-led revolution. whereby there's just a, in quote unquote, temporary dictatorship.
Yeah.
This is very much a grassroots movement, market driven, but also with a huge amount of social goodwill that's coming with it.
Yes, exactly. And it's funnily enough, it's the poorest parts of the world that are benefiting first, or seeing sort of the most obvious and most almost pressing use cases in terms of banking the unbanked, right? Because it's harder. The amount of stuff you need to prove before you're allowed to have a standard bank account is insane.
Yes.
Whereas, and this is the beauty, right? This really hit me when someone said, everyone. Not many people in Africa have a standard bank account with an institution, fill in the blank, but almost everyone has a smartphone in their hand. And that for me was so profound. And that's all you need for Bitcoin.
Yep.
It doesn't discriminate based on whether you have an address or a utility bill. All it requires of you is to have the technology to transact.
There's not been an example clearer in my mind, what you just said, that talks to the fact that this is a bottom-up movement. Because
you vote with the power of the technology. The internet's almost just a gift. The Bitcoin network is born of that network.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. This is a point. It's a critical mass point in finance, in personal finance, where you're no longer beholden in the developing world to institutions, to multi-billion-dollar companies in America or Britain or Germany. You have the keys in your hand, and it starts with your smartphone.
Yes, you have the keys in your hand in the metaphorical and actual sense, because that's what they're called in cryptography. Your keys, and they say your keys, your Bitcoin, right? As long as you own the keys, then it's yours. And so it almost does away with the need for any institutions, for that matter. And centralized institutions, I think, sooner or later become corrupted, hacked, is subject to all kinds of warping and distortion that would be unfavorable to the customers. Whereas, it's a mathematical formula that just runs, and it's stack one block at a time. It doesn't care about who you are or where you're from.
No, it's internationalist, it's non-discriminatory, and yes, absolutely, central banking, like most institutions, was in the democratic realm, were put into place to deliver basically a social service, a stable currency that could maintain sound and fair commerce and trade. Of course, this got corrupted over time, inflated, debased, defrauded even, and that's led to a situation whereby central banks, really, their only function is actually maintaining their own existence.
It really is, and some people call it the greatest Ponzi scheme ever constructed. It
very much is a Ponzi scheme,
especially with the rampant printing, because I don't know if I've ever seen a Ponzi scheme. That kind of fits the bill on many levels, doesn't it? I mean, just unchecked printing, forgetting the reasons as to why you're doing it for a second. I think that's not very long-term sufficient or sustainable.
No. Well, I think that the issue is that the central banking is intrinsically tied to the military-industrial complex. There's no such thing as a budget. There's no such thing as conservatism with spending during wartime. War, as we know, is incredibly profitable. We look at the balance sheets of the UK with weapons contracts, same as the US. There is absolutely zero incentive for these countries that have the greatest number of troops overseas to relinquish the British pound or the American dollar.
Yes, I think that's such a good point.
Yeah,
that's such a good point, because the wars that are waged are kind of like an expression, a literal almost expression and extension of the power of that currency's hand. You're almost buying dollar influence by waging war.
Yes. Yeah.
And so there was a great meme that I saw, but it really hit the mark. You had a aircraft carrier charging towards some Middle Eastern country, and that was because you know the term in Bitcoin proof of work, which is basically the hash rate and the work that needs to be done by the processors to solve the equation to secure the next block in the chain.
Right.
So basically, it was a screen of a proof of the aircraft carrier as proof of work for the dollar, and then proof of work for Bitcoin as being a wind turbine and some graphics cards. But it's quite true.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's very true though. There's absolutely that's the equivalent, the apples to apples comparison, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, war is incredibly profitable. It's incredibly speculative and expensive, and we've reached a kind of state. We've reached a crux in modern warfare, where it could very much be classed as a private enterprise, privatized in terms of the contracting. And you need, and obviously, who's the customer? The customer is the government. It's not the people. I mean, there may be indirect good or bad effects to wars historically, but ultimately the world governments are customers. And not to sound, incredibly Alex Jonesy, but there's nothing conspiratorial about assuming that the military-industrial complex is 100% tied to the current economic system, because it would cease to exist. You need something that has no leash on the amount that you can print to maintain that system.
It's the one area really of public goods and services, I suppose, if you can call it that. I suppose it is, right? That really has answers to no one and has no accountability.
Well, if you think of the media is supposed to be the fourth arm of the government. Il Quattro Stato, or the fourth estate, that's supposed to be the media. You look at the papers with the biggest influence in the UK, the top two are the Daily Mail and the Sun, and all of their anger about printing money or basically government overspending always comes back to people on benefits. It always comes back to basically the lowest levels of society. Not once do you read things that are revolving around criticizing how much we spend on aircraft carriers and tanks and things like that. That's almost like off limits. So I don't know, it makes me question, Brother Bear, kind of how well these news organizations do their job in actually holding the government to account. Are they actually in existence to, I don't know, just a thought really, but are they in existence to keep certain powers that be in the same place on the pecking order? I'm not too genned up on the British media lately, but that's how I remember it in the past years.
Well, I think fundamentally they're not values driven, they're sales driven, aren't they? So it's kind of whatever sensationalist news sells, it sells, and more often than not, unfortunately, given human nature, and gossip was always a big part of any given tribe going back millennia. Gossip sells, right? Particularly if it's about other people, and especially if it's quite deriding of certain individuals, particularly if they're in the public consciousness. So that makes celebrities, right? So
right.
It's usually quite low, sort of low brow, I suppose, in terms of interesting stuff or something that's actually of any deeper, has anything deeper meaning. It's all very surface, which is sad, but it's also the human condition, and we can't blame anyone for that. Yep, so I've kind of gone around in a circle and justified it to them.
Hey, but at least you had the humility to say it's a human condition.
It is, because who doesn't I don't know. I don't read these newspapers, Lee. I'm thinking of like a headline to come up.
Me neither. But whenever I catch a glimpse of them, or whenever I read them years ago, the military-industrial complex has never once come up. It's always look at this woman in I don't know. Look at this woman in Yorkshire who's spent £500 on a pair of designer shoes that she used her benefit checks for. Very gossip driven, sales driven, as you say.
Very surface, very shallow. Yeah, look, here's Orlando Bloom on a paddleboard naked. Amazing. Who doesn't want to see that?
Who doesn't? But Bitcoin's gonna bloody destroy it. I tell you that.
I'll
Bitcoin's
tell you
gonna...
what, mate. It's a rebaselining truth. It just needs. I think it has many purposes. I think the voting one is one we've discussed in the past around how it could be used as a token, almost a one-to-one relationship where for every, well, it's more the technology of blockchain, right? Bitcoin wouldn't probably be used from it. There would be already be some sort of democratic coin for a nation.
Yes.
A UK, and you'd only get one each, so that would be unique to you, and it would forever sit with you, almost like a birth certificate and an ID. But yeah, I think there's 1,000,001 use cases for it, and I think the more you think about it, a decentralized, objective, one source of truth is highly desirable in whatever field you sit in, right? Whether that's what's fake news, what's real, what's not real, because I think if anything's pushed through a centralized lens, there's inevitably bias and corruption that's going to arise out of that as a side effect of just by the token of it being centralized, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think whatever the motivations start off with, however genuine they are,
Yes.
Centralization, history doesn't look favorably on centralization. Whichever way you cut it, whenever governments have been more centralized, I think that, tends to lend itself to corruption, and misinformation, and I don't. I mean, this is the crux war is at, right? This is the dilemma, because we're quite internationalist in our outlook, and I think that's definitely allowed me to sympathise with the EU. But then on the other hand, this has all been at the expense. The EU has been at the expense of localism, local decision making. And it's empowered basically the debt mechanism and undermined people's decision making on a state or local level. So I believe that Bitcoin straddles both internationalism and localism or individualism in a very efficient way.
Yeah, it somehow holds those two concepts together, right? It empowers the individual, yet I suppose the individual is always the most important thing in its network. It's the individual represents a node, one of 21 million nodes on it. Well, they're not distributed one-to-one, but you know what I mean. It's like the individual is afforded agency through Bitcoin, and it doesn't care who you are or where you are.
No.
And I just think there is no technology that does that, really, because whatever you look at from a technology lens, actually currently, you can always trace it back to a headquarters somewhere.
With Bitcoin, there's an absence of that altogether, right?
Right, and it just seems to have come out of the ether. And I don't think there's any clear way that it would be stopped. I keep thinking about sort of these black swan scenarios that could arise, and it's not gonna, for example, the US as the global reserve currency is not going to go down without a fight, and it's going to get very ugly in my view. I think the US, the Fed, the US Treasury, Janet Yellen, they'll do everything just to almost the FUD, which is sort of like deriding the Bitcoin and bringing it down. For often FUD is associated with untruths spoken about Bitcoin just to, I suppose, disincentivize people from actually buying it. But I think it's an unstoppable network effect. Michael Saylor often talks almost in natural creature-like terms about Bitcoin and how it's almost like this plant, this bacteria, this microbe, not necessarily in a negative sense, that's propagating throughout the world in an organic network effect of types. And there's nothing you can really do to stop it because it knows no borders. It resides on the internet. It's the best store of value. It's the best form of money ever created, and it's the most efficient way of transforming energy into money.
Yes.
I think it just displaces inferior forms of value wherever it goes.
It does. It's funny you mentioned Janet Yellen because as the Federal Reserve chairperson, the amount of the sphere of influence she has over world economics is huge. And she said some incredible, like, things that are just outright incorrect and oxymoronic. I mean, one of the quotes that she brought to the table was, "Bitcoin is an extremely inefficient way to transact," which either shows that she's completely ignorant of how it works and how it allocates supply and demand, or she's a liar, because that's just such an outright untruth. That it's it's not even funny. It's just it's just ridiculous. I mean, I know I watched a CoinDesk. It was an interview with her when she called the framework of any cryptocurrency completely inadequate. Completely overlooking the poverty, the poverty that's come with the US dollar, the lack of democratic deficit in the developing world, in Latin America, that's come with the US dollar, is absolutely laughable. The way that she's tried to tarnish it.
Yes.
But yeah, it's in terms of its allocation, it's excellent. I think that the only black swan scenario I can think of where Bitcoin would be rendered useless is, if the entire electricity grid and internet were to go out, and then of course we would be talking about gold and guns. But we're not really talking about that situation, are we? We're talking about we're talking about replacing the banking system here.
Yes, that's right. And I think that the more they feel like they're being backed into a corner by Bitcoin, they're going to be ever more aggressive with these criticisms, warranted or not, of Bitcoin. And you can almost sense a nervousness and, dare I say, a fear of what's coming, because they don't quite understand what it is. And I think it's often the case that what you don't understand, you're afraid of, right? And so they're probably starting to become aware that this might potentially upend, not necessarily maybe to that extent, but they're starting to potentially see it as a threat, as opposed to something that could work alongside a dollar, a better dollar, $1 2.0, right, which is pegged to something real and finite. Real in the sense that you can't just funge $1 trillion, $1 trillion Bitcoin out of thin air. It doesn't let you do that. No. So I think a new standard, because since the dollar was unpegged from the gold standard, you could argue that it was doomed from that day.
Once it was unpegged from gold?
Yes.
I think, there's a strong case that it was just a ticking time bomb at that point. Once it relinquished its standard, its leash to control it. I think also the nature of how currencies are managed now has exacerbated this wildly. There are examples of currencies that have been well managed. Two fantastic case studies are the Singaporean dollar and the Swiss franc, and I'd invite anyone to look into why these are well managed currencies despite being fiat currencies. In the control of interest rates in particular, but I think that the kind of natural political landscape brought this to a next level, particularly with the euro. There's a fantastic interview with then Senator Ron Paul, where he basically talks about once the reason the euro was incredibly dangerous is because not only could you relinquish gold, but you relinquished relativism between currencies to keep one another in check. And that's also what US did, the US with their economic imperialism in Latin America. Once you relinquish that relativity and you're down to just one currency over an entire geographic or continental region, there's no stopping to the amount of leverage a government has over you. Yes, exactly. And this is what we're talking about, especially with America being a great example of that, right? Where they have sort of unearned leverage over the planet, really, if you think about it, from an economic standpoint. Whether they're doing it for the right reasons or not is almost secondary. The fact they're allowed and wield that kind of power is a bit insane if you think about it. And I do wonder whether there'll be a time when we look back on these days which was
dominated by centralization in every facet of life as quite dark, because, like we say, by overly centralizing, I think only leads to corruption ultimately. Corruption and bastardization of something that was maybe once a good idea.
I think that's a great way of putting it. I think people will look back at it as sort of an economic dark ages, in the way perhaps we look back at a time when we didn't have money, and the only methods but we still had capitalism or feudalism, but without money. The only methods of exchange were through barter and tit for tat trade. I'll trade you these 3 goats if you let me sit around your fire, kind of thing. Just incredibly inefficient allocation. The difference is this kind of allocation is not only inefficient with modern fiat currencies, but it's incredibly open to top-down corruption. Coming back to the Federal Reserve, I think it's actually exciting to watch them basically resist it and push back and say, this is inefficient, this is a terrible idea, this is corrupt. Now, the only thing I would want to throw out there, Brother Bear, and hear your thoughts on this is, do you think there will stand a point where a lot of world governments will come to a consensus and try and make Bitcoin illegal?
It's interesting. Yeah, I think some countries will try and band together, but then I almost see, for example, it's funny because I don't think they'll form in big enough groups to come to a consensus and therefore have enough leverage on the planet. Because you're talking about the planet at this point. So, for example, China wouldn't come to the US's side to defend the US dollar standard.
No.
And I can't see, maybe something like Europe or England would be sort of forced into that because of the special relationship, and maybe something like, I suppose, the the Five Eyes coming together to defend the dollar against Bitcoin, because I suppose the US dollar stands to lose the most here, right? So that's probably the most obvious challenge to Bitcoin in terms of the Five Eyes probably banding together against Bitcoin to save the US dollar, because the concern would be if the dollar dies, it better be Bitcoin that replaces it. Otherwise, it could be something like a digital yuan or something like the digital ruble, right? That might take the reins. And that's something they'd really want to avoid. So I almost think they've almost got to front run this, right? And be the first to, I think the best move they could make is put some Bitcoin on their balance sheet. They've got trillions of dollars to do it anyway. Save yourself. Because I think we're not as far as people think away from the point of where states start getting into this in a big way. I don't think we're a million miles away from that.
No.
And I think once one domino goes, I mean, El Salvador will likely be the first, and then more South American countries. Because the country with the most Bitcoin, I think, will ultimately potentially be the one that yields the most power. Now, that's maybe a far-fetched idea for now, and it may not happen.
Yeah.
But I can certainly see a world where it does.
I think it's exciting that this is a liberating force for the developing world. And I think that would be a great idea for the United States to lead the charge, put some Bitcoin on their balance sheet, as they have previously done, more so with gold, and run with it, promote it. Of course, we're not thinking like politicians, and the issue here, and this is where things do get a little bit dark, is that the US accounted for about 39-40% of all military spending worldwide. It has an absolutely gargantuan military budget. I think it's always for the past 5 years, been between $750 billion and $900 billion. So these are, these are no trivial numbers. So is there mathematically even enough Bitcoin to convert to that amount of spending, that would match taxpayer potential? And even if there were, that would almost be rendered irrelevant, because it would almost hand so much spending back into the hands of the people. So I'm concerned, my main concern is that there'll be an incredible amount of resistance to that switch over and to running with it, because It's not in the interest of the military-industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industry, the firearm industry, all these industries that basically decide elections in the US.
Yes, I think at first there's going to be an awful lot of resistance to it. So, like I said, because they stand to lose most by being the world reserve currency as things stand. They're really not going to give up that position without a fight. So, and like I said, I think it's going to get ugly. I think they'll try anything and everything to stop it. But I think ultimately they're going to have to yield. And, you know, the saying, if you can't beat them, join them.
Yeah. I think eventually it'll be inevitable if this becomes a global movement, which I have a suspicion it may do. You know, you'll need a politician with the cojones and the humility to walk the line and do that.
Well, since I sort of became more deeply interested in Bitcoin in November last year, I never thought that sort of just over 6 months' time you'd have a country adopting it as legal tender. That's a pretty wild idea. Still is, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we discussed back in university, you know, how people talked about it as kind of it was just a fun thing, like a gaming currency, or I don't even know how to explain it really, but it seemed very kind of trivial, and it just seemed like a nerdy outlet for people's internet fandom, and you know, it's now gone so much further than that, and as you say, now a nation state has adopted it. That's that's awesome.
Yeah, it is amazing. And great tweet here just regarding that adoption by El Salvador. Says Michael Saylor says this: in a country where 70% of the population is excluded from the financial system, Bitcoin is hope. The Republic of El Salvador is leading the way toward a better world.
Oh, that's fantastic.
He's always got a way with words, does Michael.
Michael Saylor. Yeah.
Michael Saylor.
Well, I think it's great, and I think this gives a lot of hope to actually people in the developed world, young people who've been robbed of a future.
Well, it also gives people property rights, right? Which arguably is the foundation of having individual agency and power.
Yeah. Well, it extends beyond that, right, to real estate and all the other applications on the blockchain.
Well, I think real estate, not so much in the way we understand it in a traditional sense, but real estate in cyberspace. So it's almost like the technical solution that gives 8 billion people property rights. Property rights to a cyber block in cyberspace, on a finite grid.
Yeah. And the key there is finite to its value. Wouldn't it be incredible if we saw? I mean, this is probably beyond the pale, but if we saw a complete kind of upending and subversion of the developing and developed world, because the developed, you know what I mean? Because we have it so good in the West, we'd obviously be resistant to this change. I mean, there's not an overly clear, not right in front of us.
It may be the great balancer.
It may be. I mean, this is kind of pie in the sky thinking, but it's a really interesting thought experiment because they've got the greatest, incentive to switch to it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what is it, that passage in the book of Matthew in the Bible? I think it actually speaks the opposite. Oh no, there is another passage. I don't think it's the book of Michael though, but it's those who will be last will be first, and those who were first will be last.
Interesting. And does that talk to the kind of the great equalizer as promised after death? Or
somewhat. I think it was speaking to the afterlife, yes, when they were saying that. Yes.
Interesting. Well, there's very, there's some huge equalizing attributes to the Bitcoin revolution. Brother Bear,
I'm sorry, just before I forget. No, go on. What were you going to say?
Oh, before I forget, I need to ask you about the environmental impact of Bitcoin. And this is I don't know if this was on the agenda today, but just looking at Elon Musk's commentary of, not focusing on it until it can be more greenly captured, and the general issues surrounding those inefficiencies, environmental inefficiencies. I would need that's an area I'm very limited on my information. So talk to me about that, Brother Bear.
Yes. So people, as a rebuttal to that, would say something like 75% of the energy utilized by Bitcoin is from renewable sources. That's not quite right. It's actually more like 23%. So they need to check their sources. But yes, the Bitcoin does lose an awful lot of energy. It is still more efficient than fiat currency in converting energy into the equivalent in value dollars. But I think what it will ultimately do is actually incentivize renewable energy. Now, the details as to the mechanism as to exactly how that happens isn't clear, but there is a theory that as renewable energy becomes ever more prevalent, what you could do is, have the likes of a solar farm or wind farm sell what you have to the grid, and then any surpluses are used to mine Bitcoin. So it's where you have these surpluses. You know how you have power grid fluctuations in terms of demand.
Yeah.
So there is a normal daily sort of almost bell-shaped curve as to when you're using sort of the electricity in your house most and least. There's almost like two humps, I think, in the morning and the evening on in most developed countries. And so to smooth that out, there is always a surplus of energy, whether that's from a renewable source or from a non-renewable source. And what Bitcoin does is, because it's so modular, is it's actually a very useful mechanism to hoover up that excess, to hoover up that excess and utilize it there and then, as opposed to it being burnt off and turned into useless heat. You're actually turning it into something of value, and so it incentivizes almost less waste.
Okay.
In doing so,
That's interesting. So there is actually a renewable. There is actually renewable use cases that could come out of it, but these won't be realized until a bit later down the road.
Yes, that's right, and I think you're going to see more and more of it. Certainly, Kathy Wood of ARK Invest. So this is this lady that heads up ARK Invest, and they're all focused sort of on the big 5 revolutions that are happening in the world of technology. So let me just tell you what those are. ARK Invest, big movements, I think it is, or something like that. It's a pretty massive ETF. So their ETFs are comprised of many companies, and they'll have an ETF for biomedical. They'll have an ETF for 3D printing. So here we go. They always produce a really good report, and they talk about sort of 5 key dynamics. So let me just find that for you. But yes, she certainly believes that there is a great use case for renewables with Bitcoin. And actually Bitcoin will, if anything, accelerate the advent of prolific renewable energy.
And in terms of timeframes, is that kind of is that sort of a 10-year or 5-year plan? Is it something that looks like it'll be realized relatively soon? What's the plan, time frame wise?
I don't think anyone's got a clear time horizon. I think it's certainly over the next couple of decades where you're going to see that. And I think it's ever going to be ever more greener in terms of where Bitcoin gets its energy to actually mine. But I must say, it's not an area I'm that hot on. So, for example, here, if I just look at this, so Elon, he's starting to come round to the idea that, yes, the Bitcoin dynamic will incentivize renewable energy, despite that it's currently only sort of 23% of the overall energy used. So let's have a look here. So China, for more than 2/3 of power is from coal, accounts for more than 75% of Bitcoin mining around the world. So that's as things currently stand. Let's see what else they got here.
From what you're saying, it sounds like the current state of affairs is it's fairly, in terms of the sourcing, it's fairly bad for the environment, but this is certainly not here to stay.
That's right. So there is a clear dynamic and a way out to a more renewable future. I think, like I said, I think 75% or thereabouts is used on non-renewables, so namely coal, particularly in China, because the miners seem to center around China. But that might change also through the fact that China's being ever more hostile with regards to Bitcoin miners, and so it being a global dynamic, that they're just free to move to wherever it's actually a more favorable geography. So that's not a dynamic that's here to stay.
I see. Yeah, and I think the fact that it is finite may also carry some less kind of extractive and exploitative incentives anyway. Okay, we may see kind of a very high peak in terms of the energy consumption, but in the long term, as the formulas get harder, as I understand it, and the Bitcoin becomes a lot harder to mine, it's ideally I would like to see, okay, maybe it isn't so intense in terms of the energy extraction.
Yes. Well, because one of the biggest overhead for any given miner is always the electricity, the source of the energy itself. I think as you see government subsidies actually make renewables that much more attractive, you're actually going to see miners by default just rotating to renewables because they're cheaper as a source of electricity as well. But it's a confluence of dynamics, of which I've just mentioned a few of there.
Yeah, and it seems like it's such in its infancy. It's almost difficult to say how it's going to look in terms of the resources used in a couple of years.
Yes, exactly.
And that's okay.
I mean, there's a lot of articles out there, like the likes of Nasdaq here, which saying again Bitcoin may actually speed up the transition to renewable energy. Yeah, so immediately miners are rushed onto public relations campaign. Yes, 2 days after Elon Musk's tweet, publicly listed crypto miner Argo announced that it signed a new agreement that is similar to the Paris Agreement. It's called Crypto Climate Accord, the CAA, which promotes industry decarbonisation. Two main objectives of CAA to reach net zero emissions from electricity consumption by 2030 and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. Interesting. So I think it's also an image thing. So as much as it's something that could actually work from an economic perspective and reduce your overhead, it's also something that we necessarily needs to be done and pivoted to in order to clean up the Bitcoin image.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think influencers like Elon Musk are great in pushing that agenda, right? Because Twitter is so transparent and so blatant and overt that once it gets bad rep out there about a certain company and their environmental practices, very quickly things start to change. I think that's one of the best social goods that Twitter has actually delivered. So yeah, they're saving face a little bit, and it sounds like it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some short-term pain for some long-term gain in terms of the environmental output.
Yes, and I think going back to the point I was just talking about, that all the miners care about is reducing their overhead in terms of the cost of the electricity. So there's a really good point here in the Nasdaq. I couldn't have put it better myself. Sort of, miners are certainly not a group of ideological people. In order for them to transition to renewable energy, it must be validated by profits. Now, this is when things become interesting. After the fixed cost of capital equipment, so the actual graphics cards and the processors, utilities, so the electricity cost, make up the largest expense of a miner. Therefore, if the cost of electricity goes down, it is the biggest leverage to their profit margin. After all, crypto mining is about maximizing the number of hashes or volume per kilowatt of electricity.
Okay, so there is a cut and dry financial incentive to reduce carbon output, basically.
Yes,
indirectly.
And this is the crux, is that the most efficient way to generate the highest hashes kilowatt per kilowatt is through the usage of solar energy and hydroelectric. You may ask why. Of course, these are the cheapest ways to produce electricity outside of government subsidized energy. You see? Very interesting.
Deary me. So it comes back to the kind of crony capitalist angle, actually.
Yes. Oh, this is a good one here. Here's one piece of evidence of this relationship. There's an example here. I'll give you a case study. We love case studies in geography, don't we, Leo?
We love it. We're made up of case studies.
During the wet season, half of the global mining takes place in one region of China, Sichuan, known for its spicy food. Side note. The reason is simple. The abundance of hydroelectricity in the region during the rainy season, Sichuan's electricity prices are as low as anywhere in the world. As a result, only 5% of Sichuan Bitcoin mining power comes from nuclear or burning coal. 95% comes from renewables. The data clearly shows that miners will seek the cheapest source of energy. And like I say, I'm paraphrasing here, hopefully that will soon be prevalent as green energy. Renewable energy will be the cheapest source of energy.
Interesting. Okay. So as the years go by, really, we can fairly confidently say that the cheaper energy will be renewable. The fossil fuels will be less desirable in terms of, the economic side of the equation, and obviously the environmental side goes without saying.
Yes, all of the climate accords that are getting pushed through, the Paris Agreement, everything as it comes together. I think the reason, it's taken renewable energy this long to compete with non-renewables is economies of scale, right? Look at the damn oil industry. Like, that has mastered the economies of scale. Look at the size of shipping containers and tankers. We've not done the same for renewables yet. Renewables haven't got the time to get to those gargantuan scales yet, but when they do, I think they will be orders of magnitude cheaper than oil, because the amount of energy required to do the fractional distillation of oil, it's very energy intensive to actually get it out of the ground, distill it, refine it, transport it, deliver it, whereas renewables can often be created natively there and then.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Sort of the actual mechanics of extraction. You've got your overhead for, say, I don't know, 10,000 solar panels that can be placed across a field in Texas. That's kind of a one and done. Obviously, you've got maintenance, but yeah, mining operations is kind of a constant overhead. The repeat costs are much higher. So that's. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Economies of scale, absolutely, and also the pure survivalism of those industries.
Yeah. The oil industries, have been through an absolute mad trajectory of scale, right? You're talking about the last 100+ years, more than that. And over that time, it's got ever more efficient, to the point of where a litre of it costs less than a litre of water.
Yeah, which is highway robbery, really.
It's just mad, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolute madness. Yeah.
And to think how labor intensive it was to get to that litre of petrol.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. But yeah, the economic case, I suppose, for these traditional fossil fuel derived energies is becoming less and less appealing, right? There are kind of trajectory graphs that you can look at. We were actually looking at these at work with the oil and gas industry, and they were basically taking a bird's eye view at the yields and the efficiencies from oil and natural gas in Alberta and British Columbia. And there's definitely, there's massive peaks and massive troughs, and there are anomalies, of course. But when you zoom out, there's definitely been an overall decline since the 70s. That was kind of the modern heyday, and seeing less and less demand for that. But yeah, I think the time will come where it just won't even become an option anymore. It'll be too exhaustive and too expensive.
Yeah, I think it will be. We'll look back on it as pretty archaic and insanely labor intensive for what you're actually getting at the end of it. And it's only but through repeat process and economies of scale that they're able to sell at the prices they do. It is actually mind-boggling, and you know this better than I do probably, where what it takes to get it out the ground to filling up your car. There's quite a few stages.
Yeah, the absolutely. I mean, all the different stepping stones. You've got the upstream, midstream, downstream, and the entire refining process, and then to get that to the vendor and in your car. I mean, the amount of carbon that's burnt just getting it in your vehicle that isn't intrinsically tied to the oil itself is huge. So yeah, I think again we're going to look back. It's funny going full circle, really, but kind of like the monetary system, we'll look back at these energy systems, these resources, and look back at them as incredibly archaic.
Bitcoin solves this. That's what they like to say, but it does solve almost everything. I think it really does solve a huge amount of things. And just going back to your energy question, the bottom line in this article sort of talks about it like this: crypto mining is simple math. Lowering the cost of electricity is the biggest leverage to their profit margin. Therefore, the incentive is heavy for them to transition to clean energy where the cost is cheaper. What's more, this might actually create a virtuous circle whereby the demand for the clean energy used by miners will incentivize utility companies to expand their renewable energy capacity long before battery technology is ready to make it viable to run the world 100% on clean energy. So you kind of see this virtuous circle potentially happening, or whether you have a relationship between the energy providers, the utility companies, and the Bitcoin miners.
It'll kind of form a triad, and being necessary for one another's existence.
Yes, exactly. And they sort of, the result being that the advent of renewable energies is that much more accelerated. There was really, because my dad, when I was texting him about Bitcoin, sometimes I just go on these rants and I just text him a load of stuff about it, and I can just imagine his face. But
well, he's a skeptic, right? He's quite.
He was, but I think he's slowly but surely coming round.
Yeah.
I think he sees the merits, but he sees it being a very bumpy ride, and I think this volatility in the price that we're seeing is almost the price you pay for the incredible gains you can have. But it's almost wrong to look at Bitcoin. I almost feel like the more I understand Bitcoin, the less I think it's about the price. It's more about what it allows you to do and what it does for the world. It's more profound than just a price on a screen. It's almost like you just keep collecting them. You should just convert some of your salary every month to some Bitcoin, regardless of the price, and do this strategy called dollar cost averaging, which is just means exactly what I've just described. You buy on a very periodic basis, regardless of the price, and that is historically the best way to do it. And I think it will continue to be the best strategy. Almost be blind to the price, just knowing that this is a finite asset that's in digital cyberspace. It's a first mover, and it's the best money you can convert your dollars or sterling into.
Yeah, I think that's quite a charming way of actually investing in Bitcoin, because you're not doing it even for short-term financial gain.
No,
you're not gambling.
That's the problem.
Yeah, and I think that's fueling the volatility, right? It's partly that it's new, but
yes.
it's ultimately the buyers and sellers. But
it's a get-rich-quick thing, right, for a lot of people, and it takes a while before you realize actually this is not even something I'll ever want to sell. It's something I'll want to borrow against, almost like I could remortgage a house. It'll be the same with a Bitcoin in 50 years' time, where I have a single Bitcoin. I can remortgage my Bitcoin or borrow against my Bitcoin as a pristine asset, much like a property, if I need the cash as and when.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it will be seen as kind of basically a digital form of real estate or gold, or traditionally stable asset eventually. I think you're buying into your future. You're buying insurance when you purchase Bitcoin. So once you treat it as a lifelong insurance plan, I think with confidence you can wear that blindfold, and even if it's just £50 or £100 a month, whether it's trading at 60 grand or 10 grand, that's where you're going to get your long-term rewards and your long-term financial security.
Exactly. I almost see it as something I will never spend, potentially. I might just pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah, or it could just be something that you spend conservatively once it's established as a proper form of commerce.
But I'd almost feel it would almost be a shame to sell even a section of that pristine asset, because, like I said, if you can there will be ways, I'm sure, to borrow against it, much like you do a property. So it doesn't make sense for the long term to even sell the property. If you've paid that property off, it just makes sense to remortgage it, and then you kind of can have your cake and eat it.
Yeah, I suppose that's kind of a two-pronged way of doing it. I think it will definitely make sense to spend when it comes to a point of critical mass where you're trying to push fiat currency out.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's also one of the end goals with this. It's actually nationalizing money, as Ron Paul would say. And nationalizing money is actually putting purchasing power and money's value in the hands of the people. So that's when it's time to spend. It's when you have that Salvadorian, that similar Salvadorian scenario, where your country has, elected for a double currency system, Bitcoin on one hand and fiat currency on the other. There'll be breaking points where you're like, you know what, I'm going to pay for this car, or I'm going to pay for this house in Bitcoin, where it makes sense. And essentially what you're doing there is you're taking the emphasis off the dollar. You're saying, you know what, I don't want this. I don't want to use this as a medium of exchange. So that would be the other incentive I could see.
Yes. Yeah, I think you could have many systems, and I think most systems will be like this at the beginning, where you've got sort of two legal forms of tender coexisting for a while, not necessarily at loggerheads, but maybe one based on the other. Like we were saying, if there is a new Bitcoin standard you can peg your currency to, then yeah, why not? You mentioned Ron Paul. He's a massive advocate of Bitcoin, and I believe he was at the Bitcoin 2021 conference in Miami that just happened a week ago. That's
brilliant. I had a feeling Ron Paul would be. That makes me feel very happy. I didn't realize. I hadn't actually followed him much lately. I mean, he's a lifelong supporter of the gold standard, and just the acquisition of gold for personal wealth. So that doesn't come as a surprise to me. But I think it's awesome because he's an 85-year-old man. He's lived a very a very energetic life as a representative and a physician, a gynecologist no less. So he really has seen it all, and he's one of those guys that's he's just such a sound voice. You listen to him talk, and I think he did his master's degree in political economy or macroeconomics or something like that, and he's just incredibly sound and measured and knows exactly what he's talking about. And I think that's why he was elected. I think he was elected for something like 13 or 19 years as a congressman. So that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that he's given the green light to Bitcoin. I'd expect no less from a genius like Ron Paul.
Yeah, and do you know what, Leo? It's almost like I do feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants when I'm learning about Bitcoin, and it's very encouraging. I feel this might be a stupid analysis, but some of the smartest people I know, are the biggest advocates of Bitcoin. When I look and the people I follow, like Naval, Vitalik, a lot of people in this space are very, very, very smart people, and that's encouraging in a weird, dumb way.
Well, I think you have to look at the kind of individuals that are doing it. Why are they doing it? What is this person? What are their motives? Is it pure gain? Are they just a contrarian, or are they just really smart and intelligent? And I think that's definitely the case. You look at your heroes and the people you look up to. What were their opinions on Bitcoin? And definitely people like Ron Paul and Naval Ravikant and Vitalik. These are incredible minds, and it gives a huge vote of confidence to the digital currency.
Yeah, definitely. I was just looking actually here on the Bitcoin.com page, and he was actually speaking at the conference. I didn't know that. So he actually spoke on the conference on Friday, I think a week ago. He was just talking about the plans to say at the conference. He said, I will argue more the case for legalization of freedom of choice and the people should make decisions and not the government. I think that's always kind of what he stood by anyway. And he also acknowledged that some people are very enthusiastic about Bitcoin and think that is the only money that would exist replacing a dollar. However, in his opinion, I think the dollar is going to be around, but it's not going to be worth much.
That's brilliant. Yeah, well, it's not going to be worth much. Well, Ron Paul, again, and this comes back to why he's such a measured man. I think he's got a great degree of foresight. I mean, he's been calling for it to be, I see here, legalized as money and not taxed. Yeah, great book by Ron Paul. It's End the Fed. End the Fed is all about basically the dissolving of the Federal Reserve System. I think he talks about a lot of his dealings with Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan was actually very sympathetic to taking away power from the Federal Reserve and reducing the printing press effect. But obviously, I think Reagan was so wrapped up in military-industrial, Iran situation at the time that it was an impossibility. But absolutely, I think Ron Paul is, he's well within his rights to say that. I'm glad that it looks good that he isn't a complete maximalist. He's not a fickle man, but, well said, Ron Paul. I think he's a defender of freedom, and that's what we should expect from him.
He's a great man. The more I learn and read about him, the more I'm fond of the chap, to be honest. He's very down to earth, and you can tell his heart's in the right place.
I think that's what it comes down to, actually. I think that's so well put, because he's not, he's not making these speeches and writing these books for any nefarious or self-interested reason. He actually, I think he has a very good heart, and he genuinely believes what he says. And I think that's awesome.
It is awesome. I'll tell you one of the rants. I'll just quote what I told my dad. But after he said, it's not going to be the global standard in a hurry, because the US will do everything and anything to block it and slow it down. So I said, this is my rose-tinted poem for your consideration. What's new this time is that it may force their hand, enabled by anyone with a smartphone in theirs. The ultimate Trojan horse, you can't point at it, it has no head you can cut off. It's an inevitable creature born of the internet, growing and spreading through an organic, unstoppable network effect, displacing inferior stores of value wherever it goes. The dollar was doomed the moment it left the gold standard. There's a new immutable standard in town, a global network of finite value, born of the internet, truly global, type 1 civilization money. In retrospect, it was inevitable.
Wow. Did you write that, Brother Bear?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very eloquently, but I think
Did you like it?
I loved it, and I think the last line's very poignant, because I think the more and more we look back and look at the trajectory of the internet, we'll be like, why didn't we bloody do this all along?
Yeah, I know. Because, but I think this is what I mean. It's like the independent. Some of the headlines I see at the big news media outlets make me believe we're still very early.
Oh well, we are. The thing is that we are incredibly early, and I think there's so many people that don't have faith in it for very good reason.
Yes.
And you're replacing the banking system here.
This has been in place for forever.
Yeah. There's been fiat currencies. Effectively since the Roman times. Romans had their own fiat currencies, although they weren't anywhere near as bastardized as the way they are today. Those were dictatorships back then. But the thing is, no, that's the ironic thing. But you also have to think of people's savings, right? I mean, your average. I actually have found, and this is completely anecdotal, maybe there's studies to support this, but the greatest amount of resistance to Bitcoin, I've actually seen it mostly in baby boomers.
Yes, that's very true, yes.
Because obviously the young see opportunity and they want to run with it. The elderly don't give a shit and are probably old enough to remember some kind of scenario when there wasn't so much printing of money. So they're kind of keen on a different scenario. But the baby boomers, the lucky generation they are, they've kind of reaped the biggest rewards of fiat currency.
Yes, exactly. Well, they've seen, I suppose, one of the biggest economic booms in recent, ever, really. Over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early 2000s. I mean, that was an incredible boom, and an incredible amount of people were lifted out of poverty into, middle classes and having a very decent standard of living, and that's probably most recently being exemplified in China, right?
Yeah.
And so the current system has its merits. I don't think what we're saying is we're not shitting on the system and it's totally awful. It has its merits. All we're saying is that it can be improved upon quite dramatically, with the likes of blockchains like Bitcoin that preserve value forever and ever.
Absolutely. The current system has delivered a lot of wealth and uplifting for so many people, right? I mean, there's so many good aspects as many as there are bad. I just think that this new system of trade and commerce, this new money, digital money essentially, is going to replace that with something far more democratic and efficient.
Yes,
keeping it
exactly.
pure, very simple. I think democratic and efficient. That's what it's going for.
It's democratic, yeah, and it's very individual, but it's also not. It's also like this network creature that's permeates everything and creates us into what we really are. When you look at us from the space station, which is just this blue marble in the endless void, right? And so that's what we really should be. That's the conceptualization we need to all arrive at sooner or later, if we're going to survive as a species.
Yeah, I think the blockchain marries two important concepts. You've got the wonderful one world theory, and that beautiful blue and green marble bobbling around in space as being one race, one world, basically. But it also embodies it marries that with the very subjective and individualist nature of capitalism, and
Yes.
not many economic apparatus have been able to achieve that. Usually it's one or the other, right?
Yes, that's very true.
So it's marrying both of them together, and to bring it back to the doctrines of Austrian economics, all value is incredibly subjective. And on a theoretical level, it preaches that one person's treasure is another person's trash. And I think that Bitcoin is incredibly smart in the way that it upholds that sort of subjective value that you get from Austrian economics. Traditionally that's been at odds with more global agendas and internationalist agendas. So this is a new era, a new dawn, really.
Yeah, and it's almost not done it from any big superpower. It's not centralized, so it's completely just. It's already come from a globalized network, which is the internet. So it really didn't. It's really amazing because it's kind of done it in one fell swoop. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
It's not like it's created ever larger geographies that have consolidated over time. It's just used the internet, which has kind of leapfrogged all international boundaries and grown from there.
Yeah. I mean, the solution to those issues posed by nation states, actually, the initial remedy was the EU and the UN, NAFTA, fully integrationless products of globalization. But those actually didn't work very well. That's the thing. They didn't, in the sense that they brought prosperity to more nations in the developing world, but they actually were poor in the way that they allocated wealth, and they didn't solve the issue of people not being in control of currency. This comes not from any kind of trinational or international organization. This is completely grassroots, and it's very, very exciting.
It is. It's a beautiful concept, and I can't wait. I'm very excited for the future. It makes me more excited for the future than ever, just knowing what this could be. And I think, in the words of German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, all truth passes through 3 stages: First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. Brother Bear, thank you for joining me. It's been a journey.
It's been a beautiful journey. Fantastic way to end the podcast. Over and out, Brother Bear.
Over and out.
Pow! Pow!